We're about to start session 4. It is entitled Promoting Safe, Nutritious, and Sustainable Consumption. Again, let me introduce the two rapporteurs and the chair of this session. The rapporteurs are Dr. Tassani Sadi Manon, who is an assistant professor in the School of Development Economics at the National Institute of Development Administration. We think it was being NIDA, which is here in Bangkok. The second rapporteur is Dr. Chayada Patrakom, is an assistant professor in the Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics here at the Faculty of Economics at Gesetsad University. The chair is Dr. M.On. Udamgate Mali, is the senior advisor and former director of the Institute of Nutrition at Mahidol University, also here in Thailand. She also is an adjunct associate professor in the Department of International Health at the Bloomberg School of Public Health, Bloomberg School of Public Health, Johns Hopkins University in the United States. She holds leadership positions with numerous international research and policy development bodies, including the International Food Policy Research Institute. I'll turn it over now to Dr. M.On. and her panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Good afternoon and welcome to session 4. As you are aware, promoting safe, nutritious, and sustainable consumption is the desirable goal of transforming food systems towards good nutrition and long-term health. Following food supply chain as food environment at the market venue that includes food availability, affordability, quality, and safety, amongst others. All these factors influence the choice and behavior of consumers. In this session, we will begin with the experience from the Philippines on consumers' food choices during the COVID-19 pandemic by Ms. Marie-Claire Custodio, Associate Researcher, Market and Food Systems Research, International Rice Research Institute, and a PhD candidate at Ghent University. Followed by the market transformation of agricultural products in Indonesia during the pandemic and focus on Agri-food digital market by Dr. Sahara Chanuddin, Head Department of Economics, Faculty of Economics and Management at Bogor Agricultural University. And our last speaker, Dr. Jody Harris. She's a global lead specialist on food systems at the World Vegetable Center, who will share with us the COVID-19 impacts beyond production, highlighting changes in food environments in Thailand and the Philippines. Each speaker will be presenting for about 20 minutes. We will run through all 3 presentations and then open up for questions. Please type your comments or questions in the QA box and kindly specify to which speaker you are addressing your question to. Without further delay, let me invite the first speaker to give her presentation. Ms. Custodio, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much. So, good afternoon again. I am Marie-Claire Custodio, and I will present today our study on consumers' food choice during COVID-19, evidence from urban consumption zone in the Philippines. We are all very familiar with that day when the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 as a pandemic in March 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic is not only a health crisis, but posed risks to global food security, including food access and nutrition. It affected and continued to affect both demand and supply of goods. There has been many discussions on how societies and the food system become resilient and policy measures to overcome the demand-side shocks on food supply chain in different contexts around the world. The Philippines is one of the hardest hit in Southeast Asia and one of the countries in the region where prolonged lockdowns were imposed. A year after confirmation of the first cases of local transmission, lockdown measures at community level continue to be imposed in the country, particularly in the capital city of Metro Manila. The lockdowns greatly affected the ordinary lives of Filipinos, including work from home arrangements, fewer online classes, mobility restrictions and curfews, adjusted operating hours of establishments such as stores or markets, grocery, among others. This study aims to provide empirical evidence from a developing country to support the increasing number of studies and policy papers tackling multi-sectoral impacts of the pandemic. We look at the food environment in Metro Manila and dietary diversity before and during pandemic based on in-home consumption of household members. We framed the questions to middle-income households as during pandemic, which referred to yesterday's recall from the day of interview, and that is a year after the onset of the first lockdown. And before pandemic, which referred to a typical weekday before the lockdown. As a health crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic has affected the different components of the food systems. Within the food systems framework for diets and nutrition, our study focused on the food environment, on consumer behavior, and diets, particularly diet diversity. We examined diets following the general guidelines for measuring household dietary diversity and complemented this with the gastronomic systems research framework to capture different sources of heterogeneity. Specifically, we look at the food environment, eating occasions, and dishes that goes with the eating occasions, and ingredients for the Household Dietary Diversity Score, or HDDS. We did an online survey among 600 middle-income households in April of 2021. We talked to food decision maker and those with involvement in meal planning and food preparations for the household. We adopted the general guidelines from the FAO to generate the Household Dietary Diversity Score based on in-home consumption of household members. We followed the 12 food group categories or classification based on ingredients of dishes consumed. We then computed for the Household Dietary Diversity Score for the day and by eating occasions. So these are breakfast, morning snack, lunch, afternoon snacks, dinner, and late night snack. We computed for the HDDS for 2 reference periods before pandemic as the baseline and the HDDS during pandemic. So that is a year after the onset of the first lockdown. Starting with the food environment, which is the interface where actors from the supply chain interact with the consumers. The food environment in Metro Manila can be mainly classified as an informal market, with public market as the main purchase channel. During the pandemic, more households buy food from small neighborhood stores or what we call the sari-sari stores for specific food categories, specifically rice, bread, eggs, milk, and milk products. We also observe decrease in number of households who buy these categories from the supermarkets. For cooked food, for cooked food for in-home consumption, we've observed the food environment as a combination of formal and informal markets. It is also not surprising to see the increase in purchase of cooked food using the online platform. Now, let us look at the baseline household dietary diversity score. So this is the period before the pandemic, and we framed it as a typical weekday before the pandemic. In a typical weekday before the pandemic, dishes consumed in-home are mainly comprised of 7 food groups across all the 6 eating categories, which I mentioned earlier. So these are breakfast, morning snacks, lunch, afternoon snacks, dinner, and late night snacks. So majority across all these eating occasions, majority of households consume dishes from the following food groups: cereals, vegetables, meat, and egg in a typical weekday. Further examining the household dietary diversity score by eating occasion before the pandemic, lunch and dinner had higher HDDS than breakfast and snack occasions, with an average of 4 food groups. By food group, we've observed that egg is unique during breakfast, legumes, nuts, seeds unique to lunch, and fish and seafood food group is unique to dinner. For these snack occasions, so that is morning snacks, that is between breakfast and lunch, the afternoon snacks between lunch and dinner, and late night snacks. Dishes consumed during these snack occasions are mainly comprised of 2 to 3 food groups. And also we've observed that cereals, meat, and sweets are common across snack occasions. Let us now look at the household dietary diversity score during pandemic. So in our context, this is a year after the onset of the first lockdown. Did it change? Has anything changed? And what changed? Similarly, with the reference period of before pandemic, majority of households include cereals, vegetables, meat, and egg in their dishes in a typical weekday during the pandemic. And on average, dishes consumed in-home are comprised of 7 to 8 food groups across all eating occasions. If we will compare the household dietary diversity score between the 2 periods, the mean household dietary diversity score is significantly higher during the pandemic. So that is 7.4 versus 7.6. One of the possible reasons for the increase in the household dietary diversity score during pandemic is inclusion of 2 food groups in more eating occasions during the pandemic. So these are the food groups for legumes, nuts, seeds, and milk products. However, we've also observed inclusion in less eating occasions for the food groups of egg, fish and seafood, and sweets. And one of the interesting results that I would like to highlight is that of the food group for fruits and white roots and tubers. Fruits and white roots and tubers food groups were consumed by fewer households before pandemic. So that is the baseline. And we've seen no significant change in the number of eating occasions for these food groups during pandemic. For fruits, only less than half of households consume fruits in any of the 6 eating occasions in both periods. And during the pandemic, about a quarter of households in our sample or in our study even further increase their consumption frequency of fruits. I will now go to insights gained from our study and recommendations building upon past studies and policy recommendations that are already out there in the literature. First, for the food environment. Our study provides empirical evidence from urban consumption zone in the Philippines that informal markets are important sources of food and livelihoods in developing countries. Our study also supports earlier studies indicating that the food environments have been altered by the pandemic. Within the informal markets, our study suggests a shift from supermarket to local neighborhood stores for some food categories. An online platform was utilized by more households in buying cooked food for in-home consumption. Secondly, on consumption, the mean household dietary diversity score increased during the pandemic. This increase may be attributed to increase in consumption frequency for two food groups, legumes, nuts, seeds, and milk products. However, we've also observed reductions in consumption frequency of nutrient-dense food, particularly eggs, fish and seafood, and fruits. And there's no significant change in consumption frequency of staple or food groups that are included in dishes for the main eating occasions. So these are cereals, vegetables, and meat. For the policy recommendations, we build upon past studies and recommendations that are already out there in the literature. So first, strengthening localized markets, which provide outlets for diverse foods and are often better able to respond to disruptions and changes in demand. By shortening supply chains or linking producers to markets, by providing adequate storage facilities, especially for perishable goods, to minimize wastage and contribute to improved accessibility to consumers. Secondly, a mechanism for efficient distribution system to ensure accessibility of nutrient-dense food in informal markets. By scenario planning for movement of goods from production to consumption zones for varying levels of mobility restrictions that can be used currently during the COVID-19 pandemic and for future health crises. And lastly, strengthening digital e-commerce platforms and mechanism for safety net for both sellers and consumers. For instance, to avoid scams and payment mishaps, so that even small-scale entrepreneurs and vulnerable households can safely engage in this platform. So thank you very much for your attention. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much for sharing that very interesting experience. I really appreciate that, and you have really kept on to good time. Since we have, the session will have the Q&A, so we'll keep the question for you towards the end. Thank you. And I am very pleased now to invite Dr. Sahara Jainuddin to share her experience in Indonesia. Dr. Sahara, you have the floor, please.
Can you hear my voice, Dr. Emma?
Yes, I can hear you. Maybe
Okay.
speak closer to the mic, please.
Okay, I will try to increase the volume. How about now?
Yes.
Is it better?
Yes, it is. It's clear.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen from Indonesia. I'm speaking here on behalf of my colleagues, Rizky Permani, Priya Sumbada, and April Laili Sakti, and Sarifa Amalia for the project of COVID-19 pandemic and shift in consumer shopping behavior, advancing innovation and resilience in agricultural youth. The projects supported by the Australian government through the Australian Centre for International Agriculture Research, ACR, and the Australia-Indonesia Institute of Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade Defense. The title of my presentation is Market Transformation of Agricultural Products in Indonesia, COVID-19 Pandemic and Agri-food Digital Market. Similar to many other developing countries, agriculture sector has an important role in Indonesia. In 2021, the contribution of agri-sector at the upstream sector and downstream sector to the Indonesian GDP were about 13% and 7%. During pandemic, while many other sectors experienced negative growth, the agriculture sector still has positive growth, about 1.7% in 2020 and 1% in 2021. Agriculture sectors, both upstream and downstream activities, has important roles in labor absorption. Approximately 100 million people working in the agriculture sector, including farmers and small and medium enterprises. Apart from its important roles, there are several challenges faced by the Indonesian agriculture sector. The majority of farmers are smallholders, with the average land holding about 0.5 hectares with low formal education level. As we can see here, the majority of farmers not graduated elementary school or only graduated elementary school. The majority of farmers face several constraints including knowledge, capital, and information constraints. And the smallholders also struggling to distribute and market their product. Talking more deeply relative to marketing and distribution aspect, as we know that much of agriculture products are produced in rural areas by smallholders, while the majority of consumers live in urban areas. Therefore, the value chain of agri-food products tend to be long, involving a significant number of intermediaries, heavily dependent on well-functioning long-distance road and rail transportation networks. Prior to COVID-19 pandemic, the existence of convenient and modern food retailers in Indonesia actually has successfully linked smallholders and consumers. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, the use of online agri-food marketplace increased significantly. As we know, agri-food digital markets can reduce transaction costs among exchange partners. From the consumer side, online transaction costs reduce the time needed to shop and to access a wide range of products conveniently. And from the producer side, they can sell their product directly to consumer or through fewer intermediaries. However, to participate in the digital markets, smallholders or suppliers are required to acquire a new set of skills to improve their understanding on the use of digital technologies, online payment platform, cyber security, and digital marketing. And they also need to provide funding for the new investments to purchase of new devices and supporting system. This condition raise a widespread concern among researchers and policymakers whether small farmers or sellers will be excluded from digital market development. Therefore, it is important to identify the needs by small producers or traders or farmers to enhance their participation in the digital market.
Yes, I
Taking into
can.
account the perspective of e-commerce suppliers and consumer, the presentation aims to examine shopping behavior of Indonesian consumer during COVID-19 pandemic, determinants of adoption of digital market services in Indonesia, the willingness of consumer to continue shopping through digital markets after the COVID-19 pandemic, challenges and opportunities faced by digital market suppliers, and the roles of youth in digital markets. And in order to address the objective, the study team conducted 2 surveys, consumer survey and producer surveys. And we use structured questionnaires. And the agri-food products include fruits, vegetables, chicken and its processed product, beef and its processed product. And we analyze the survey data by implementing descriptive statistic and profit model. Aside of digital market, similar to in Philippines, farmers can also sell their products through traditional and modern channels. The majority of small farmers in Indonesia rely on traditional channel in selling their products. The channel tends to be long, include many middlemen, as we can see here. There are a lot of participants in the channel, starting from farmers, small traders, big traders, wholesale market, and retailers. And the intensity of coordination control between the action partners is low, and no specific farm gate standards are imposed. Farmers in this channel can decide when to plant, which varieties to plant, and how much to plant. And there's a lack of commitment among action partners to repeat the transaction with the same buyer in the future. In contrast to traditional channel, the value chain of modern market include fewer middlemen. As we can see here, the products are delivered to specialists or sellers and going directly to supermarket, processor, and exporters. And the modern market impose new procurement practice, including strict requirements of product in terms of product quality and consistency. And they establish their own supply chain and preferred suppliers and more formal transactions. And let's move to digital markets. Agri-food digital market actually can be categorized as modern channel. They use direct purchase arrangement to minimize the middlemen. So the products in the digital markets are going from farmers to middlemen and then directly to digital markets. And digital market also implements fixed requirements for their products, and suppliers need to assure continuity in terms of quantity, quality, and hygiene practices. And they also need to fulfill skill to use devices to access online market, smartphone, internet, and then application, Wi-Fi and marketing application. And let's talk about the buying channel. Yeah. As we can see here that during pandemic COVID-19, there are several buying channels used by the consumers to access agri-food products, including wet market, peddler, stalls, supermarkets, mini markets, specialized wholesaler, and online channels. As we can see in this figure that during pandemic COVID-19, the use of online channels for agri-food products including beef and processed beef, chicken and processed chicken, vegetables, and fruit increased significantly. Our findings also reveal several interesting characteristics of online agri-food consumers. As we can see here, the majority of consumers who shop through the online channel have a full-time job compared to those who shop through the offline channel. And on average, respondents in the two groups have internet access in their houses. However, the internet access in the offices for respondents who shop online are higher than those in the offline channels. And about 88% of respondents who shop through online channels stated that online channel stores are more visible in their areas compared to those who shop through the offline channels. And respondents who shop through online channels perceive that the COVID-19 pandemic is the main reason why they shop through the online channels. And Related to the education level of consumers, about 40% of respondents who shop through online channels, have a formal education level equivalent to bachelor level, while 42% of respondents who shop through offline channels have a lower formal education level. And the results of Probit model shows that there are several factors influencing the adoption of agri-food digital market in Indonesia, including age of household head, and then education, type of jobs, availability of online channel services around respondent cities, and product quality, including food safety aspect. And as expected, the COVID-19 situation has a positive and significant effect on the decision of consumer to select the online channel. And as we know that by using online channels for shopping, consumers can comply with the regulation as well as minimize the risk of being infected by COVID-19 imposed by shopping in the crowded store. When we ask consumer relative to their likelihood to purchase agri-food products through the online channel in the era of the new normal or during post-COVID-19, about 62% of respondents stated that they will continue actually to buy food products through the online channels. And the main reason why they continue to shop through online channel is the uncertain situation about COVID-19 situation. And talking from the perception of producer or sellers or farmers related to digital market in Indonesia, our finding show that the online agri-food sellers have a small scale business, and the majority of online sellers are females. And they include as the young age generation, about 31 years old, and they have relatively high education level, 13 years formal education or equal to senior high school. As outlined previously, to participate in digital or online markets, producers or suppliers or farmers are required to acquire new set of skills and provide tools and supporting system. As we can see in this figure, the online agri-food seller use several tools for business purpose. About 78% of our respondents use personal WhatsApp account for marketing sales, followed by mobile phone, Instagram account, Facebook, and etc. And from the right side figure, we can also see that online agri-food sellers use a variety of smartphone applications for marketing their products. The first is photo editing and design graphic, delivery application, and mobile banking. And agri-food online sellers also need to fulfill specific requirements to the quality of products and food safety aspect as proved by the certification. As we can see here, halal certification is the most common certified provided by 80% agri-food online sellers. This is because that Indonesia is the biggest Muslim country, and therefore it is important to ensure that food products sold in their store is halal. And apart of halal certification, others food safety certificates, for example, certificate from Indonesian Food and Drug Agency, Indonesian National Standards, and also organics are also important for the consumer who shop through online channel. And talking about the payment method, as we can see in this figure, bank transfer is the most popular payment system used during the transaction, as stated by 73% of respondents, followed by cash on delivery, payment at ATM, e-wallet, OVO, and Shopee. Talking about seller perspective related to the post-COVID situation, about 88% of online agri-food sellers state that the opportunity for marketing agri-food products through online channel will increase. And when we ask about their likelihood to continue to market agri-food products through online channels, about 96% of our respondents state that they will continue their online business. And what about the roles of youth? As we can see from this figure, the majority of our respondents stated that youth have important roles in the development of agri-food e-commerce in Indonesia. And they state that youth can involve in the technological innovation, marketing, creative business model. And for the conclusion and implication, digital market will continue to grow during and post-COVID-19 pandemic. This will increase consumer access to food products and provide enormous policies for industries or traders to sell food products through the online channel during post-COVID era. And there are several factors that significantly influence the decision of farmers to adopt digital market, including age and education of household, type of job, availability of online channel, product quality, including food safety and COVID-19 situation. Younger customers with high level of formal education and having a full-time job are the potential market for food traders in the digital market. And for digital agri-food traders, it is important to maintain their product quality. And the involvement of youth is important in fostering the development of digital market. And the results of our study are also relevant for the agriculture policy in Indonesia and how to link smallholders to the consumer through online markets. I think that's all about my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sahara, for keeping such good time. And the experience from Indonesia really had adds on to what we have heard from the Philippines, and I am very sure we have some of the interesting discussion to come. This sets a stage for sharing across ASEAN of the knowledge we can learn from during the pandemic. So now we have, it's a pleasure for me to invite Dr. Jody Harris to share with us the study from two countries, Philippines and Thailand. Dr. Harris, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Emma. It's good to see you. Great. So good afternoon from Bangkok. Thank you for inviting me and inviting the World Vegetable Centre to join this program. It's been a really interesting couple of days. So for those of you who don't know this centre, just briefly, World Veg is a research for development organisation, and we focus on healthier lives and more resilient livelihoods through vegetables. And in this region, we're hosted by Kasetsart University in Bangkok, and some of the work that I'm going to present today was in collaboration with Kasetsart colleagues. So today I'm going to present a set of 3 studies, as Emma said, across Thailand and the Philippines. And we've been looking at how healthy diets have been affected through changes in food environments and food policy in both countries through this shock of COVID-19. So the studies are in progress. They're almost finished. So these are early findings that might feed into policy debates in the region as we start to, I hope, emerge from COVID-19. And I should say that we've been communicating with Claire from the first presentation a little bit on the Philippines work as well. So today, obviously, we're talking about COVID-19, and I think it's important to note that this is not the first shock, of course, to global food systems, and sadly, it probably won't be the last shock. So that's why we did this study, to learn from the current crisis to be a bit more prepared for the next one. So we wanted to look at the effects of COVID on food systems and health diets in ASEAN. So we chose what, at the time, were quite differently affected countries with quite different sets of food policies and lockdown approaches, so Thailand and the Philippines. And what this study aimed to investigate is what happened to policy, to the economy, and to society with direct relation to food systems for healthy diets over the first 2 years of COVID-19. So these were 3 separate but interrelated studies. So on policy, we looked at policy processes and change in policy with relation to food systems. On the economy, we used the cost of a recommended diet method to look at food costs and then look at affordability and impacts of social protection. And then on society, we looked at people's experiences of their food environment through the pandemic. So I'll present some preliminary findings from all 3 today. But first, I mean, where were we pre-COVID? So the problem is diets in both countries already did not meet the international recommendations. So I'm focusing here on vegetables as part of a healthy diet. So for vegetables, even before COVID, the global target is around 300 grams per adult per day. The regional average for Southeast Asia is just over 200 grams. And in the Philippines, average intake of vegetables per person per day is around 110 to 130 grams, and in Thailand between 90 and 150 grams, depending on which data you use, but it's far too low in both countries. So the shock of COVID intervened into an already imperfect food system. And then we all know very well how much these two countries and others were affected by COVID. So this shows cases and deaths up to the end of 2021, which was the timeline focus for our 3 studies. So the question is, what did this mean for policy, the economy, and society with direct relation to food systems and diets? So first, we wanted to see what changed at the policy level and why. So we reviewed existing food system policy documents and documented policy changes related to the food system through the pandemic. And then we spoke to key informants about what changed and why. So of course, I mean, governments have a raft of policies, a whole range of policies and strategies and guidelines and pieces of legislation in place across the food system already. So for instance, ASEAN has regional guidelines on developing food security and nutrition policy. In 2020, just before the pandemic, the Philippines launched its national food policy, which aims to consolidate lots of different sectoral policies related to food systems. I should say this policy only mentions vegetables 3 times, so clearly that alone doesn't adequately cover the complex issues which are limiting nutritious and vegetable-rich diets, but it's really good to have food systems at the forefront of policy thinking. And then Thailand doesn't have such an overarching food and nutrition policy, but events around the UN Food Systems Summit. Somebody's not muted in this. I can hear them a little bit. So events around the Food System Summit of the UN started to discuss whether Thailand should have a vegetable policy that looks across the food system from farm to fork. And both countries already had policy on things like keeping staple food prices stable, for instance. So the point is there was a landscape of policy in place when COVID hit, and that conditions what could then be done during the pandemic. And then COVID hit, and we wanted to understand how that affected policy. So this chart shows the combined severity of COVID-related policies in each country. And this provides some background. So there were relatively severe responses in terms of lockdown and health mandates and other things in both countries, restricting people's movement and activities. Of course, we all experienced that. And you can see that the Philippines had slightly stricter COVID policy responses throughout most of the pandemic than Thailand did. But these metrics don't focus on changes in food-related policy. So that's what we wanted to add in this first study. So first, we mapped a sort of policy timeline of lockdown actions introduced by government, and we color-coded them according to the severity indicated on that Oxford timeline in the last slide, so the red and yellow and green colors. And then we mapped COVID mitigation policy introduced by governments, which had a relation to food systems, so that's the blue and pink colors. I'm sure you can't read it, but just to give you a sense. And this gave us a list of food system related policy changes in the era of COVID-19. And then, so new policy to mitigate the impacts of the virus and of the lockdown policies on food were in broadly 4 categories that we found. So policy that aimed to keep food flowing first, globally and within national borders through things like dispensation of transport or shop opening or flow of goods, so that's in purple. Then there was policy aiming to stimulate the economy more broadly, including through international loans, that kind of thing, so that's in light blue. But most policy, by far, was in the area of social protection, so largely through either extensions of existing welfare systems or one-off or multiple cash grants to specific groups, so that's the dark blue. And then in addition, we moved to major actions by civil society, things like community pantries and vegetable growing and sharing initiatives where those reached scale. So in terms of mitigation of food-related impacts, Thailand introduced a lot of different policies for different people and to address different issues over the first 2 years of the pandemic, with most of the social assistance policies relatively short in duration, around 3 months. And the Philippines had a slightly different approach. It had some specific policy for different groups, but largely it contained all of its key mitigation policy within 3 extensions of a big act called the Bayanihan Act, building on established cash transfer program. So crucially, written food policy didn't change as a response to COVID. What changed was this sort of short-term legislation addressing specific parts of the food system in response to that national perception of needs. So our next question in our next study then was, did this policy get the needs and responses right? So one key issue is, of course, the cost and affordability of food. To protect healthy diets, people need to be able to access the right food. So we looked at this in Bangkok and Manila because the data weren't available nationwide in those countries. So in 2020, the diet recommended by the government cost an average of 67 US cents per person per day in Bangkok. And of that, 40% was the cost of staples and 13% the cost of vegetables. And then in Manila, the average cost of the government recommended diet was twice as high, at $1.43 per person per day. And of that, 38% was staples and 19% vegetables. So the figures at the top show the extent to which food expenditures were adequate to meet the minimum cost of the recommended diet before the pandemic. So Bangkok residents spent on average 1.8 times the minimum cost of the recommended diet, so they could have spent less and still, in theory, have achieved the recommended diet. While Manila residents spent only about half of what is minimally required to eat healthily, so they needed to be able to spend more. And then food price data from each country show that the initial lockdown had no effect on the price of vegetables in Bangkok, and the overall cost of a recommended diet hardly changed. It declined by about 3%. And then in Manila, COVID-19 resulted in a slight increase in the cost of vegetables and fruit of about 7%, but the overall cost of the recommended diet didn't really change. So the cost of food was not hugely affected by COVID in these cities. What was affected was people's ability to afford it. So as background, of course, we know formal unemployment jumped in both countries, and of course, informal workers were hit hard by things like lockdown policies. So in our findings, almost all households in the data for Bangkok could, in principle, meet the minimum cost of the recommended diet before the COVID-19 pandemic. But 40% of the sample in Manila already could not, before the pandemic, afford a healthy diet. And that amounts to 5.4 million people when you extrapolate it to the population of Manila. And then during COVID-19, if we estimate a 20% contraction in the household food budget, the minimum cost could not be met by 14% of the sample in Bangkok, so that's over 2 million people if you extrapolate it to the city population. In Manila, a 20% contraction in those food budgets led to a similar 15% increase in the number of people unable to meet those minimum costs. And that translated into almost 2 million additional people who are unable to meet the cost of a recommended diet during the pandemic. And of course, we know that some people lost more than 20% of their income through COVID. So those are probably conservative estimates. And then with government relief funds, social protection provided during COVID-19, the minimum cost of the recommended diet would in principle be affordable to almost everyone in Bangkok again, assuming that the relief funds were spent evenly over the year and that other costs didn't increase. We didn't look at that. But in Manila, the population unable to afford the minimum cost during COVID-19 would only reduce by 5% with those funds. So, of course, we know that not everyone was also able to access those relief funds. So affordability of diets really was a key issue in both cities. But in Manila, the social security provided by the government didn't go far enough to protect the diets that the government recommends. So what did that mean for people in the last study? So in order to put some human stories behind those numbers, we spoke to people sampled from population groups known to be marginalized in the Philippines and in Taiwan societies. So groups like migrant workers, those living in slum areas, and informal food systems workers. And so this is work in progress, but initial themes coming out included, of course, a lot of uncertainty and anxiety around food. I mean, I think that goes without saying. Lots of stories of cramped households and caring responsibilities, but of course the ability to share wages from those who could still work. Lots of stories of limited incomes and lost jobs, but also people were grateful for the social protection that was there, but recognized its limits. Of course, physical food access restrictions, people couldn't always access what they needed, and that reduced affordability that came out so clearly in the last study. And then stories around home cooking, but often less times per day, maybe even once per day. And lots of stories of things like neighborhood sharing and ways of adapting. So there were some very powerful stories of COVID disruption to healthy diets. We're now analyzing the data according to what we already know about food environments. So we want to understand which aspects of people's food environments were affected most and how they experienced their food environment during the pandemic. So from those three studies, I just want to highlight three preliminary conclusions, and of course, maybe more once we finally analyze all of the data. But the first one is around social protection. So having existing social protection policy really is key to maintaining an affordable diet alongside affording everything else that we need in life. So it's already well known, of course, that there are strong links between social protection or welfare measures and nutrition outcomes. Several other COVID policy studies have also found that social protection policy, and in particular existing social protection systems that can be scaled up with need, is really crucial for the welfare of the most vulnerable in particular. So our work adds to that evidence for food systems for healthy diets. Production and markets were not really the issue in these contexts, but affordability and access were. And social protection can, in that sense, be seen as a food system policy to protect diets. Second, of course, marginalized groups are going to find it harder to maintain healthy diets in these shocks. They should be prioritized in both routine and emergency food policy and legislation. Again, that's been observed in other studies looking at other health and welfare issues, and we add work here on food systems for healthy diets. And then an additional point that's related to that, having data on things like food prices or incomes nationally is really key, because then we can look at regional or population variations that can inform policy responses and understand who is marginalized and why and how we can help them. So that's missing in those cases. And then my last point, so how a country is doing before a shock obviously conditions how a country will do during a shock. So different shocks can be short run or long run, and global to local, we know that. And we saw in previous slides that different shocks can affect very different parts of the food system and affect different populations differently, especially with that equity lens. So it's important to have coherent and pro-health and pro-equity food policy in place routinely, so that we can maintain healthy food systems through shocks like these that come along. Getting pro-health food systems policy in place is obviously a complex process. It requires not only a strong evidence base that we're all talking about today, but also the political will to create and to fund such policy. And of course, for companies with vested interest in food systems policy that is not necessarily pro-health, to be strongly regulated to protect public health. And that's not happening in lots of countries. My own country, the UK, we had a very strong anti-obesity policy that was just last week overturned through the lobbying of companies selling unhealthy foods. But with relation to this region, an example would be that the Philippines' national food policy is being governed by a consortium of government and food industry. So we need to monitor quite closely how pro-health policy is created and implemented, and particularly the winners and losers and how the most marginalized are affected, and particularly through shocks that make both our food systems and certain populations more vulnerable. So then just in summary, so other research before has of course tried to learn from past shocks, and our work builds on previous work in those areas. And I'd like to think that we're gradually learning what works to help food systems, and particularly to help the most vulnerable populations affected by changes to sort of weather the food shocks. It's clear that not all food policy is in the area of agriculture and markets. I think we know that. So public policy in other sectors, and today we've talked about social protection, is also key when taking healthy diets as a food systems outcome. So the challenge now then is to pass and implement strong policy in support of food systems for healthy diets in anticipation of the next shock. So I just want to thank the funders of this research, the Taiwan Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and to thank again our Thailand hosts, Kasetsart University. With that, many thanks, and back to you, Emily.
Thank you very much, Jody. That was really informative, and I think it would motivate a few discussion. So, and thanks for keeping on the time too. So we now would have an opportunity to let me invite all three speakers to please turn on your video. And I have lined up some of the questions from the audience. So let me start by Ms. Custodio. There's a question that I would like you to consider. It seems likely that the reduction of dietary diversity is related to low-income households. Could you please give us a reason why you collected online survey by focusing on middle-class households?
Yes, thank you for that question. Yes, that is true, and it is an opportunity to further extend this research or get the insights from the low-income households outside of the study that we conducted. That is definitely a limitation on the methodological side, because during the time when we conducted the fieldwork, that was there's another restriction or lockdown that was planned. So capturing low-income households is mostly effective through face-to-face interviews, but the conditions did not allow us to do that. Hence, we focus on the middle-income households. But we are still working on the data, and we know that in Metro Manila or in Philippines in general, the middle class, it's a broad range. Like the middle income or the range for the middle income, the lower limit is 19,000 and up to 115,000. So that's a huge range. So there is also an opportunity for that. And we are planning to look further into categorizing the results by low middle income class and the upper middle income class. So thank you very much. So that is fully acknowledged.
Great. I think I'm glad that you are going to consider all those. And you know, my observation, and it's very interesting that an increase the diversity score, household dietary diversity score during the pandemic, and it has more eating occasions and all those. I can't help but, from a nutrition side of view, how are their intake on the ultra processed foods, you know, or you say nutrient dense is being on the decline, but if the energy dense is up, we're going to see more obesity or overweight coming out. Is there anything you have on that?
We decided, or in the design stage of the study, we focus on the HDDS, so that would pose a, or that would, so the HDDS would not capture the quality. We only, in terms of quality of diet, but only we use that to have a sense of the diversity or diversification of diet based on the food groups. So we focus on that, yeah.
Perhaps the next stage, when you are going to do that, there's something of that we really would like to see, if the healthy diet capture nutrition as part of that. And thank you. So let me move to Dr. Sahara. Are you there? I can't see you.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Dr. Sahara, you have is there a question for you in the box? And I think I saw.
Yes, I have already answered the question from Pedro Bueno.
Oh, you already have?
Yes.
Okay. Let me ask you, it is very interesting about the agri-digital market. And one of the questions that come up has to do with, can you explain a little bit more about the variable that you use on perception of product quality sold through the online channel? Does it mean they think it's better or what?
Yes, as I mentioned previously, that our consumers perceive that products sold at the online channels have higher quality in terms of freshness and also in terms of food safety issue, because as I mentioned previously, that online channel need their suppliers to fulfill some food safety certificates from the Indonesian Food and Drugs Agency and also from Indonesian national standards. And also in some cases, the online sellers also conduct laboratory tests in order to check whether products that delivered by their suppliers fulfill the food safety aspects need or implemented by the online sellers.
Right. Well, one of the issue with that, and I really think that this is a very good experience that you share, because I think in every country, the online sales market on particularly on food has soared so much, has increased so much. So I can't help, and then one of the inquiry that come along has to do with, what would happen if the growth of agri-digital market is likely to persist, and you say so, post-COVID? What would happen to the local stores, the peddlers, and some of the others? What do they have to do to survive?
Yes, it is also our big question. So for the traditional channel particularly, and also other modern channels such as supermarkets and convenience stores, they currently adjust their selling system, not only rely on offline system, but also they start to use online system in order to market their products. Although some of, for example, traditional channel peddlers, something like that, currently they haven't used websites to market their products, but they currently are already moved to use social media like Instagram, Facebook, or WhatsApp groups, something like that. So adjustment is also important for them in order to gain the market during and post-COVID-19 pandemics.
Right. Well, that's I think it's really good to know. But one of the things that I can't help thinking of is that I think you talk about the youth and the younger generation that really enjoy online digital things. But somehow, for some of us, the older adults, we still love to walk to the market and touch the food, be able to see, and yet there's something about being in the marketplace and it has colors, it has interaction. So I really think there are still some that would probably attraction for both of those. But thanks for those experience and to share. And if you don't mind, there's a question for you that you have already answered. Is there any online marketing scam?
Yes, I have already written my answer to Pedro Bueno. I mentioned that besides provide several advantages, transaction through online channels might be risky because some irresponsible consumers, might suddenly cancel their order, give fake order, provide fake payment receipt, something like that. And from seller side, there is also possibility that sellers will not provide good quality products as promised on the pictures in their website. And also cybersecurity is also important issue when we conduct online transaction, since other people might take our personal data, including our banking accounts and extra. And therefore, it is important for consumer to select credible agri-food marketplaces when they buy agri-food products from online channels.
Yes.
That's my answer, Jelly.
Thank you very much, because not everyone seen that that answer. Okay, so and thank you for sharing that answer too. So now
You are welcome.
we're gonna come back to the second round. There are more questions. I have to say there are interest, but we will do second round. Let me go to Dr. Harris. Jody.
Hi.
Hi. That was a very interesting comparison. And one of the thing is that for what you have just said about the different costs of living and particularly, I was wondering about, at the moment, it doesn't seem like before, when you gather those data, we don't have the Russian and Ukraine conflict. At this point, because of energy supply crisis, because of economic going down, because of all those, the food price is soaring sky high. The wheat has gone up 40%, and all those is much more. And I think one of our audience has already commented that we have COVID didn't drive the price of food as severely as Putin. So I really would like you to possibly project a bit and go from what you have, and you have already good point about social protection, and then we have shock after shock. Now that we have multiple shocks, what is it that you think would be good to counteract that? You talk about some of the pro-health food policy and others, but now that there's so multi-dimension, it's not just health that we have to think of. It's nearly combination of all the things that we are now. We're living in a different world, that a pandemic seems to be tame in comparison to what we are having. So can you advise how we can survive this next coming year? When the food system. Yes, please.
Yes, I guess in some ways we are lucky that that the war came after the pandemic and not during, because multiple crises on top of each other would be even more complicated. But multiple crises, one after another, is also really important. And I think one of the important things to look at is which parts of the food system a particular crisis is affecting and where and for whom. So the COVID crisis, as we saw, at least in the context that we were looking at, and I think this is the case with a lot of contexts actually, it wasn't an issue of supply and it wasn't an issue of markets. Those managed to keep going because governments managed to put things in place to let transport through blockades or to let markets function, or people went online to find food if they had access to that and had an address that someone could deliver to. So COVID affected more the affordability and accessibility part of the food system, and therefore the appropriate policy was something like social protection. The Ukraine crisis, from the bit that I understand of it, is affecting grain prices. And so that's affecting a whole different part of the food system and affecting the food system through a very different route. So in that case, perhaps it is raising the cost of food rather than affecting people's incomes and therefore that side of the equation. So there would be a different set of food policies that would need to be implemented, or responses that would need to be implemented to deal with that, because it affects a different part of the food system. And I think you're right in saying, I focus on the food system outcome of a healthy diet because that's my interest, but we always need to consider the multiple outcomes of food systems and the trade-offs between getting a healthy diet and making sure we don't destroy the environment and making sure that people who work in the food system can have a fair livelihood. And so thinking about those trade-offs and how they're affected through these different shocks in different ways and for different populations with an equity lens. So who is it that's being affected by these rising food prices, and is that different or the same populations that are being affected or were affected or perhaps in some cases still are through the COVID lockdowns? So I think getting into that level of disaggregation of which bits of the food system are affected, which populations are therefore affected, and what policies would make sense in mitigating those. That's a responsive approach. And I guess my point was that we need food policy in place that anticipates these things. And a lot of that will help if we have diversity in the food system. So I don't just mean dietary diversity, but I mean diversity in the sources of our food, where it comes from, how you can access it, maybe even how it's produced. At the moment, the agrochemicals are getting very expensive because of rising fuel prices. And so perhaps it's not always, that's not the only way we should be producing our food. We should have a diversity so that it is more resilient to shocks. So diversity across everything, from the way we produce food to the way we sell it and access it to what we eat, is really key in being resilient to whatever shock might come. Understanding which bit of the food system and which populations are being affected. Now that will look different in different contexts. I'm not saying Thailand needs to pass the same policies as the Philippines, for instance, so policymakers will know their contexts well, but there are principles there that can be applied, I think. I'll leave it there.
Thanks for that. And I think I have opened the Pandora box because there seems to be an interest in that. So let me look at the comment that we have. Pedro has a comment that the food system goes back to the inputs, and fertilizer, for one, is not only very expensive now, that's not enough. Agrochemicals is probably, yes, that's how he left that. But I think that the question, the next one that come in, seems to me quite relevant to all three speakers to possibly to say something about. And I really think that this is where we look into the way forward and what is coming as a reality. And so I would I would just pose this question for all three speakers to possibly give us some of your insights on this, and then we may have we may have time for a few more questions specifically to some of the speakers. But at the end, I hope that I could have a minute or two for each of you to say something that you think is the key message for the audience to take home with. Okay, so now the question here is, if the current war between Ukraine and Russia continues, what are the immediate strategies that can be used to solve the food crisis? So let's hear from the Philippines. Ms. Custodio, what do you think? Has there been some discussion? And particularly, I know you're from Rice Research Institute. The situation with rice, staple usually is protected, but not. But even with that, what happens to this in terms of supply and demand, and what do you think would be a good strategy that we can help with this crisis, food crisis? I mean.
First, I would like to bank on what one of our attendees pointed out, that fertilizer is not only very expensive now, and that inputs are very important and has been greatly affected, which in effect affected the entire value chain, specifically for rice. So their soaring input prices has put the farmers' incomes and livelihoods at stake. So the government should continue to protect the farmers at the producers level, but there's also at the consumer level, although there are many imports that is flooding the market, especially in our country, there's also a question on, as what Dr. Harris has said, affordability of the health diets. So that is that combination, or that diversification in terms of consumer access and consumption, to not only to the staple food but also to different kinds of diets, so that we can still protect the consumers, especially those that are nutritionally at risk. Yeah, so maybe I'll just put it that way at the moment.
Okay, thank you. So let's, thank you very much, Ms. Custodio, for that insight. And it's, what about Indonesia? What have you been discussing in terms of how would you mitigate this problem of food crisis due to the conflict that is ongoing? If it's keep ongoing, and the pandemic is not yet, we can't yet claim the victory on this COVID war, not yet. And the war and the current conflict is still continue. Has there been any thought about what you think would be very good strategies to help?
Yes. The fruit price, particularly for staple food, increased significantly in Indonesia, including vegetable oil. As you notice that in Indonesia, our governments are struggling on how to reduce the price of edible oils in Indonesia. So there are several strategies actually conducted by our governments. First, it is our governments continue to increase domestic production for food, for staple food. Through the increasing productivity by implementing smart farming, precise farming, something like that. And then there is also a big budget relocation, government budget. focus to increase staple food in Indonesia. And also currently we try to implement the more integrated value chain in Indonesia. So the distribution from producer to consumer can be run very smooth. As you know, that Indonesia consists of a lot of islands, so effective and efficient value chains of agriculture products is important to be implemented in Indonesia. And also, we focus to fulfill Indonesian domestic first. As you know that our president just banned exports of our palm oil to many countries currently. So it is still debatable, but I think in order to fulfill our domestic needs, I think it is important. I think that's all.
Thank you. And it really gives me some idea about solidarity, about coming together, about the ASEAN and beyond, about how the world may have to remap. How do we really surviving all these shocks rather than just country by country? But when we have to solve this, you know, what happenings in one area of the world seems to impact everybody else. It touches all of us. So it takes all of us, those who are affected, and the government has to take that into how do we get out of this together, not just one by one. So protectionism will not work long term, but people will have to try and say, okay, we have to keep something for the family or something for the country. But we have to consider the world as well. Jody, you have any thoughts?
Sure. I mean, the impact of the war in Ukraine is not my specialist area.
I know.
It's Agri-food, who have been doing a lot of thinking on this and on sort of long-term issues to do with the war in Ukraine or other shocks. As I say, there are so many different shocks that affect the food system globally or locally, and this is clearly a key one. And one of their points is that one of the reasons that this Ukraine war in particular has impacted our food supplies so badly is the hyper specialization, where we just outsource the growing of a certain crop to, you know, one or two areas in the world. And if those areas are affected, either they choose to stop exporting or they have a war and therefore can't plant. That affects the world. And so I agree with you that protectionism in its extreme is not the idea, but also this hyper specialization doesn't work for a resilient food system. So we need to find a balance between, you know, strengthening national food systems that don't only grow, you know, they're not banana republics. They don't only grow one thing, and they provide through a mixture of trade and local production the foods that are required for a healthy diet, and to do that sustainably and make sure that there are livelihoods for people. So investing in national farmers, investing in infrastructure for local food markets, investing alongside mainstream agriculture in forms of agriculture such as agroecology that aren't so reliant on chemical inputs, as has been said already. So it just come back to the fact that it's about diversity, and that if countries in ASEAN are pursuing this focus on hyper specialization, it's not a particularly resilient approach to food systems.
Thank you very much. And with you know, all those thoughts that come together, we really come to the you know, the last 5 minutes, and we have that. And I really have to thank all the speakers once more for sharing all these highlights with us. And it's if you can, and if you would like to give a key message to the audience, one key message from your talk, what would that be? Ms. Custodio, let me start with you.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you again for inviting me and for inviting us in this seminar. So the key message that I would like to impart or point out at this point is the systems approach in dealing with shocks. COVID-19 is not only a health crisis, but as the discussion went through, it's clear that it has multi-sectoral impacts, and that systems approach is not only at the macro level. We've talked about the macro level as well as the household level. It affects our own households, the consumers, the families. So the household should also cope with the shocks on a systems approach thinking, like protecting health and nutrition, ensuring education, and not only education in terms of infrastructure, but also the quality, and protecting income, so that in the end we could still protect the nutrition and health outcomes of our family. So that's it.
Thank you very much. Dr. Sahara,
Yes.
your key message, please.
Yeah. COVID, as we know, that COVID-19 pandemic has shifted the way consumer to access food. So in order to obey social distancing policy and implementing health protocol, digital market developed rapidly in Indonesia. As such, it is important to ensure, that smallholders will not be living by the rapid development of agri-food digital markets in Indonesia. Because participation in a digital market channel can be associated with higher prices, higher returns, and more stability in volume and market certainty. But we know that to participate in digital market, there are several challenges faced by smallholders. So it is important to overcome the challenges. From the government perspective, the government should provide relevant training on how to produce high quality products, as well as conduct grading and sorting that can meet the requirements needed by online consumer, including food safety certificate and other certificates needed by online consumer. And there is all the effort to attract young generation is also important, since youth are very familiar with technology development, including artificial intelligence, smart farming, features in digital market, and etc. I think that's all about my key message.
Thank you very much. We also face that kind of dilemma where farmers are pretty much of an older generation, and the younger generation of their family doesn't want to do farm, doesn't want to anymore. But now with some of this technology that's coming along, it's attract them. So I agree that is also one of the points that's very good to make, how to attract the youth into more to these food systems. And Jody?
Sure, yes, very briefly
from you,
then.
the key message, please.
Sure. So I guess from our research that I presented today, a really key point for policy is that whether making everyday policy or policy in a crisis, we need to understand impacts on different parts of the food system and different populations, and make sure that we can look at those trade-offs and understand the equity dimensions, and use some of that more in-depth knowledge to make policy decisions alongside what will always be a political process. So yeah, I think that's my last point.
Thank you very much for that statement to take home with. Yes, we are at the end of session 4, but I would like to take this opportunity to thank very much the organizers and the speakers who really have made this very lively presentation and discussion, and of course, the audience out there. And I also have to specifically thank my 2 rapporteurs for this session, who has been so helpful throughout this. So with that, we have come to a close, and thank you very much. Hope you enjoy your day สวัสดีค่ะ